Amy Erickson, you are a lecturer, uh, theologian at St. Mark's. Could you please introduce yourself?
Nice. Well, you've already got me well on my way. But yeah, so I teach theology and ethics at St. Mark's in Canberra. I've been in this position for about 2 years now, but as you can tell from my accent, I'm originally hail from the US, but then I did my master's and PhD studies in Scotland. So and I'm now find myself in this part of the world, which has been a joy.
Wonderful, fantastic. Um, so I'm going to be studying at St. Mark's this year. Believe that you will be one of my lecturers. I've signed up for ethics,
Yes.
and I'm really excited about that. I'm very much looking forward to taking that class with you. Um, so I've got a few questions I'd like to ask. We'll start at the beginning. On your spiritual journey, did you feel a calling at any point, that something that said, theology is where I want to go, faith and spirituality is where I see my future?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. And the my yeah, ironic initial answer is, if anything, I feel like I experienced a kind of anti-calling.
Anti-calling.
And
Okay.
let me flesh that out. So I grew up in the Presbyterian Church in the United States. Kind of grew up in a household of faith. So I guess a big aspect of kind of my own journey, inner growth in faith, was kind of making my faith my own, as opposed to just my parents, or kind of just a habit or cultural default. And even though Presbyterians are more known for being called, often they're called frozen chosen, so not being particularly kind of
Frozen
emotive,
chosen. Love that.
um an emotive group. My tradition that I was in was kind of caught into a kind of more general evangelical American kind of matrix. So somehow I developed an impression even as a child, that I was supposed to have this sort of conversion sort of experience that was supposed to be sort of dramatic and sort of emotive in some kind of way, but I never had such a thing. And so I think I remember being about like 7 or 8 and praying the sort of Jesus prayer like over and over and over again, because I didn't feel anything, and I kind of
Hmm.
I felt like it didn't work. And I remember kind of sheepishly approaching my mom about this and kind of asking, like, pray this Jesus prayer, but I kind of don't feel anything. Like, like, did it not work? Like, am I a Christian? And her response was something along the lines of like, look, you're you're not necessarily gonna always feel this all the time, but that doesn't mean that you don't belong to Christ, or that Christ isn't with you. So I feel like my
Hmm.
initial kind of major lesson in my life of faith was, okay, I'm not always gonna feel this, and that's okay. And I think that lack of feeling is also then what drove me to studying, especially the scripture at first. The Bible was something I could hold in my hands, I could study, I could research it. And that kind of set me on a kind of theological trajectory. So in
Hmm.
some ways, I think it was almost a lack of feeling of my faith, I think, that drove me to study. Maybe initially as kind of compensation, but I think in God's grace and economy, it has since then developed into a way that I do love God and know God.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think, when we talk about uh, a religion of love, we want to experience that in some tangible way.
Yeah, and then I think in our culture we do confuse love with a certain kind of emotion that has certain, especially kind of warm, fuzzy kind of
Yes.
connotations attached to it, as opposed to maybe something that actually gets expressed through a kind of extended commitment and action through time that
Mm.
might persist even despite a certain kind of feeling. That's, yeah, kind of a different kind of love than the kind of romantic um, type that often gets sort of flouted in our culture, I think.
You were telling me about the Frozen Chosen and how your journey sort of began, and you were raised in a very religious household in the United States, but perhaps you rebelled a little bit against that, and you wanted to sort of find your own spiritual path.
Well, what's funny is I actually kind of didn't have a rebellion.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
the closest thing I can think of is again, some point earlier on in my faith. I couldn't tell you how old I was, maybe early teens or something. I did
Hmm.
have a season, and again, couldn't tell you how long it was for, if it was a matter of months or a year, where
Yeah.
I feel like I almost had to sort of suspend my faith. It wasn't like
Okay.
it wasn't like I was denying it or rebelling, but and I don't remember there being any kind of crisis that precipitated it, but it was almost like I had to just sort of hit pause and think, like, okay, wait, am I real about this? And almost had to kind of take a step back from even my faith in God, which was weird because I was still wanting to pray, and I was like, well, but can I pray about how I'm experiencing this?
Okay.
And again, the best word I can use for it is that I sort of suspended my faith, and
Suspended.
again, I couldn't even tell you for how long that was for. It might have been actually a very short season, but and maybe there was even a just internal sense that I kind of had to authenticate my faith in a way by sort of stepping back, but it didn't really materially result in much in my, I guess I'm kind of in my external life at the time. But I do wonder, again, going back to academic study, and ironically, it was the kind of anti-calling that led me to kind of academic theological study. If I think study itself has given me an outlet for processing my doubt. And I do wonder if I hadn't, and I got a bachelor's in theology, and even before my undergrad, I was reading a lot of theology and such. So I do wonder if I didn't have the more formal outlet of academic theological study, if I would have experienced kind of doubt or rebellion in, kind of maybe more of your kind of classical kind of ways. I do remember, again, in a kind of maybe typical kind of theological academic fashion, having almost a kind of intellectual crisis with my faith when I was doing my master's. When I was studying in Scotland, I was doing my master's dissertation. I was trying to figure out, I was doing it in Old Testament. I was trying to figure out how the heck do you read the Bible? Because I was having to work on my method section for my master's. And I had this I did have this one day where I was almost kind of depressed, like feeling this despair of, I have no idea how you actually read the Bible. And I was at that time actually wrestling with the Hebrew text of the book of Hosea, which I did my master's thesis on, which the book of Hosea is like some of the most convoluted, contorted Hebrew grammar in the Bible. And like oftentimes the verses are actually just like nonsensical, and they come out all nice and clean sounding in English translations. But actually, if you go to the Hebrew, there's a couple of verses where you could translate it any number of ways. And I had this moment of like, why the heck is this God's means of revealing himself to us when I can't even make sense of this text and what it's saying?
Why can't it be more straightforward or more obvious?
Right. Yeah, this is such a rubbish way of communicating. And I end up having conclusions that I make about even the Hosea text in particular later on in my work. But I did have that moment of, I think it wasn't so much doubting God but it was this kind of like crisis of how do I even know God, or how does God reveal himself to us?
How does God reveal himself to us? That's a great question. And if we might just return, you said you suspended your faith for a bit. Can you recall anything that made you resume it? Was there something you said? Yeah,
that's a good question. To
be honest, going down this path.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, and it's, I don't know, maybe there's some weird psychology going on that I can't even remember a whole lot about that season. But I actually, I think it was kind of a gradual, just sort of putting the mantle back on of kind of my rhythms of faith and reading and prayer and life. Yeah, it's weird. I don't remember there being a specific incident that precipitated it, and I don't remember there being a specific thing that kind of marked my exit, I guess. Yeah.
And that sort of feeds into the second question I was going to ask. Can you remember, either when you were younger or at any time, an event you experienced which really challenged your faith, your belief system? How could God allow this to happen, or how can the world be this way?
Oh yeah. I mean, the kind of crisis of interpretation was kind of maybe in that genre. I mean, obviously, like any person, there's been moments of suffering that I've encountered, more close up. That, and what amazes me is, I mean, theodicy is like a classic theological question. Why is it good and all powerful God allow suffering? And theologians have wrestled with that for centuries. But yet, and what's so funny about that question is, it's like each each specific instance of pain forces you to revisit it, because it's almost like the question is so abstracted that you almost have to ask, well, but why, like, why this particular suffering, you know, because suffering is so just so well diverse, right? And so as with any person, I guess I'm amazed, as much as being someone who's had the luxury and privilege of getting to study theology formally so much and wrestle with that theodicy question, and yet any unique instance of pain still forces you to ask it. And I think that's in some ways how it should be, because it does, each individual instance of suffering and pain forces you to confront God about it, if you're still, you know, think God is there to be confronted on it. And I realize I've answered your question very abstractly, and I haven't named specific instances of pain. That's but you know, there's been family members going through like depression, or my family actually went through, our neighborhood had a fire go through it, and our house ended up making it, but a lot of our neighbors lost our houses, and that was a really weird suffering.
Why did
of like
these houses survive and those ones
survivor's guilt? And so it's just each individual bit of suffering kind of raises its own question and challenge. And then I think individually then forces you as a person of faith to integrate that into your life and walk with God, and kind of wonder with God why, even if you don't get, you know, nice tidy answers in the form of, you know, published theological articles. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Brilliant. So following on from that, can you think of a time in your life where faith and belief have carried you through something difficult?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as I was thinking about this in advance, I appreciate getting those questions ahead of time. So I've gotten to travel and move around the world quite a bit, and a huge blessing has been part of this global body of people, where I can land. Twice now I've actually moved to countries that I've never visited before. I moved to Scotland before I'd ever visited Scotland. I moved here before I'd ever visited Australia, and, you know, knew hardly anyone in either of those locations. And yet and the gift of being part of Christ's body, I immediately have a family who welcomes me in, and I have, you know, homes to have meals at and whatnot. And so I've gotten to experience the truth of that one verse that I'm going to butcher, or at least paraphrase. But, you know, for anyone who like forsakes homes or family or lands, you know, receives, you know, tenfold in this lifetime. And I've gotten to, you know, experience that in a humbling and meaningful way. And again, it highlights how faith isn't just my faith, but it's the faith of a living body of people, which also extends through time, includes you know, past believers too.
Okay, wonderful. So, and leading on from that, you mentioned you did your master's on the book of Hosea. Is there a particularly significant or personally significant passage in the Bible that you often reflect on, or a religious quote that you bring to mind?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am partial to the book of Hosea, but I'm actually going to reach for another Old Testament book that was actually one of the first ones that when I was kind of a bit younger, for some reason I was really drawn to, and like it was my first memory of really trying to read the Bible really seriously. And I keep returning to it, and that's the book of Ecclesiastes. Which I almost feel funny about naming that as one of my favorite books, because it, on, you know, first blush, it doesn't seem particularly Christological. It doesn't seem and it even, you know, might be even hard to see how the gospel is kind of in there, although I think it definitely is. But it's just such a rich, I mean, it's in the heart of the wisdom literature. And it really speaks to, it's you know, and as with all the wisdom literature, it's outside of the sort of drama of salvation history and the sort of cults of the temple. And it's kind of just how does God's grace sort of touch us in the like midst of our everyday normal life. And in that sense, I think it is actually really Christological. And what I especially, I mean, I do love that classic Ecclesiastes chapter 3, the poem on time. Although there's a verse that's a couple of verses after the main heart of that poem that often gets missed. And it's something like, God makes everything beautiful in its time. I just love that. And some of my own theological work and some of the figures I've grappled with have actually ended up reflecting quite a lot on time. And it's still so mysterious to me how God chooses to use time to kind of reveal himself and invites us to journey through time, and in the midst of that experience and slowly see the beauty he's kind of rendering in the midst of that. And so that's a verse in a biblical book that yeah,
wonderful. The book of
to.
Ecclesiastes and the nature of time, and how everything is beautiful in its own time. And finally, are there any insights, because you've studied the Bible extensively, you've been a person of faith for many years, if you could summarize your spiritual advice, what's the most important lesson that you could share?
Yeah, that's such a great question and so challenging to try to answer. But the word I'm going to land on in response is the word wonder. And again, academic theologians are probably most guilty of being people who try to kind of lock up information about God into a nice kind of tidy, sanitized sort of box. And the more I study and the more I live, the more impressed I am by how little I know. And it's also this withering down of like, it's almost like I'm less and less sure about more and more things, but then I'm just more settled on a kind of, core that's developing. But then from that kind of core that you are sure about, you can just open up to this posture of wonder, which kind of is almost this sort of contentment with not knowing, but yet still having that curiosity to know and being open to just being sort of open to not having to know, but be delighted by the wonder that is, again, God's creation and recreation in Christ. And so I guess to return to your question, I think you asked what kind of insight I would recommend, and that would be just try to develop and cultivate that posture of wonder in life. Yeah.